she attended a Armchair Traveler event. I want you, Jared, I want you to say hi, our new librarian, if you haven't met Jared. Jared Jacobon.
Hello, everybody.
And he's,
hi, my name is Jared.
He's going to instigate some really neat things at the library. One thing is some computer classes coming up.
Oh yeah, we got a computer classes starting on the 29th of this month. And the first one is going to be the basics of computers. So if you are somebody who's not familiar with computers at all, we go from everything of this is how to use a mouse, this is how you turn on the computer, and we cover up to a few keyboard tips and tricks that you can do of like how to just use a keyboard to copy and paste and save things without even having to use the mouse for that. So we show you a couple of tips and tricks, get you the very basics, and then each month we'll either be meeting once or twice a month, and we'll be covering a different topic. So that's one of the things that we have coming up this month of new programming that's coming down the way. But tonight's program is a different program. We got our Armchair Traveler today, and so we're excited to be having Miss
Ellen Colodney.
Thank you, I'm sorry. I should speak. Not many people can say my last name, so. But we are so happy to have her today come and speak to us about erosion control and how you can use native plants to help protect the waterways in Shorelines County. So let's give her a big round of applause.
I have a couple more things to say. Number one, about Armchair Traveler. Next week, Katie Sanford. How many of you heard her talk last year? She was terrific. Everybody wanted to hear her talk again. So anyway, she's going to be here next week to talk about the Great Dismal Swamp, how it started. Everybody knows how Washington was involved, but do you really? And talk about the Dismal Swamp, native plants and animals and things that are there. So she's very, very, very interesting. And then Hayes Farm, Samantha Dixon's going to come talk about what the plans are for that. Many of you have heard that before, but maybe we'll get some updates. And I want to alert you to a change of date because Columbus Day, the library will be closed on a Monday. So we're having Gerald Thomas from Bertie County come talk about Civil War Union naval occupation. And our last Armchair Traveler on October 17th is history. If you want to see this, you got your phone, your smartphone, take a picture. I've got one right here. I should have had more copies, but anyway, it's really great. Some things that are coming up. And this is sponsored by the Friends of the Library. We encourage you in November, we're going to have our membership drive to join. And if you don't want to do that, and if you just want to leave a donation, these are free programs, but really, the money helps us to do things that are added value to the library. I've known Ellen for a number of years, and she is quite an entrepreneur. She's a problem solver originally. She was a doctor. Let that go and started her own business. And kudos to her, you know, even during rough times, she gets a business plan and takes off. And I know personally she's given a lot, she's sold a lot of native plants to the golf course, which has helped to keep the water and the Albemarle Sound, which is what we're talking about, and the waterways along here a lot cleaner. So, Ellen, we really welcome you. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for having me. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So I'm going to talk about erosion control with native plants, which is sort of traveling to your backyard. So I guess it's traveling. So in our territory where we live, I guess most people are from Shorelines County or surrounds, we have a couple ways of getting erosion. We have the running water after rain erosion, and we have the erosion driven by winds during storm. And if you've been out to the waterfront, you probably recognize this. And the town has worked very hard to try to stabilize this area. Okay. I have to use the left button on the right arrow. It's going to be a challenge. And we have erosion driven by a combination of the two, and sometimes it gets really bad. So The problems with erosion, besides property damage, is also to the larger environment. It's sediment in the rivers, nutrients that are carried in the sediment, and a reduction in the soil quality of your area, your yard, or your farm field. And this has really impacted this region, this erosion off of developed or farmed areas. And for instance, the Yopon River used to be a black water river, and it's now functioning as a brown water river with a sediment bottom, which is a whole different chemistry than it used to have because of the sediment that it's accumulated. So in most cases, if you have an undisturbed, naturally vegetated area that's got, you know, your leaf litter, or it's got a good plant canopy, they're remarkably resistant. So nature has a very good way to use plants to prevent erosion. And if you have an area, say, which is experiencing sea level rise, if allowed to retreat, these areas are really stable if they're allowed to retreat and recolonize and extend and rebuild. But there are some exceptions. We happen to live in one of the areas of exceptions, which is the Albemarle Pamlico Sound, the steep banks that we have in some areas, and the bluffs. Those are areas that erode currently at about a couple feet on average in the Albemarle Sound a year. In some areas, way more than that. And vegetation alone is not capable of stopping that. Those areas have had perfectly healthy vegetation, and it does not handle that degree of pressure. This is the site, the Lost Colony site, and they're working on it quickly because that bank that they're on is eroding.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Why is that happening? Is that a natural process, or have we contributed to it?
So the fundamental erosion along the sound on these bluffs and high banks, that is independent of people. There's just such a long fetch. A lot of you I know are sailors. So there's such a long way for the wind energy to drive the waves, and it gradually cuts the bottom of the bank until the bank falls in. And I know that I remember speaking to somebody a while back who was elderly. She's passed away, but she was probably 90 at that time, and that was 20 years ago. And she grew up on the tip of Drummond's Point. And I asked her, how far do you think it's eroded? And she said, oh, about 1.5 miles. And that probably is true. So, because she grew up when the fisheries were there, and it has eroded that much.
In the old days, before they cut the trees down, the trees were out in water.
Yes.
Now, that would have been beneficial in those days.
It certainly was. And those trees, though, when you think about it, those are cypress trees. They only germinate on land. They have to start their life on land that then gets flooded typically. But it shows you where the water used to be, where the land used to be. It was out there. When you see a cypress tree that's out there, it used to be land, or very shallow. And they do protect the shoreline. So if you have, it's like mangroves, if you have enough cypress, it helps the shoreline. But it's still, when you have these banks where they can undercut the base of the bank, they will, in that degree where you have, 2 miles, etc. of fetch, the plants alone aren't going to hold it. They have it historically, or prehistorically.
I live on the southern side of Albemarle Sound,
Yes.
and I go out 100 yards and I can find bricks, old bricks,
Yes.
and things where houses used to be.
Yes. Yes. So we are kind of in a unique area. There aren't many places where this actually happens to this extent, where it's not human generated. Usually it's human generated. Now, our approach typically as humans to controlling erosion is to make it hard, okay? So we figure if we can put cement on it, it's going to, or a vertical seawall or a vertical bulkhead, that's going to stop the erosion. The trouble, and it does often work for instance, on the Albemarle Sound, if you're going to stop that kind of erosion of those bluffs and high banks, that's the only way you're going to do it. Because there's nothing that can control it without that. Now, those bulkheads are going to fail, but it's the only way you're going to stop that degree of erosion. And actually, the net benefit to the environment is positive in that particular case because of the phosphorus contained in the soils, and you're keeping that out of the stream. It's one of the rare cases where hardening a structure is actually beneficial and the best choice. Usually what happens when you put a hard vertical surface or even just a hard surface, what happens is that the wave energy reflects off that surface and goes to the nearest thing it can break down. So it will go and it will undercut underneath the bulkhead. It will go to around the sides of the bulkhead, but the energy is still there. It's just moving to a more vulnerable area, and it can go over the bulkhead. The way that nature approaches erosion control is quite different. It uses basically an abundance of, there's two approaches. I'll get to the second approach later. But basically these soft stems, this whole mass of soft stems, it dissipates the energy. All the energy hits and it gets reflected back and forth and it cancels itself out. And at the same time, any sediments, any soils that are in the waves, the water, are going to get settled out. And I think it is that a 20 meter marsh, I probably have it later somewhere, will knock the wave energy out by 50%, and a 31 will knock it out by 90%. So they're really, really effective. Just, it's breaking the wave energy rather than reflecting it. And so the tops do that. The bottoms, the roots bind the soil and keep it from washing away. And this little experiment of just pouring water into these vegetated, mulched, and dirt. And you see how much dirt is coming through. So to be effective at stopping erosion, plants need sufficient tall stems that persist year-round. So unless you only have erosion happening in the summer, you need something that's going to be present during the winter. So, and it's got to have, the more stems it has, the more effective it's going to be at dissipating and absorbing that wave energy. So typically, the grasses or grass-like plants are going to be great, and they have to have sufficient height not only to break down the above the water, you know, the wave energy above the land, but they also have to be tall enough to have really vigorous, deep roots to bind everything together. So turf grass in general is not going to cut it. It has neither the sufficient stems, it doesn't have enough height in its foliage, and it doesn't have sufficient roots for anything but very, very low energy situations. So this is a very common scenario. The waves are hitting the bulkhead in the storm. This would be typically storm-driven. It's going above the bulkhead, and it's eroding at the toe, at the base where the grass is there, because turf grass just doesn't do it. It's just a very weak erosion control product, plant. So plant selection, how do you choose plants for this? They have to be capable of erosion control. So we're looking for fast growing with year-round tops of sufficient height, deep running roots capable to be commercially produced. You got to be able to buy the thing. And it has to be completely, absolutely adapted to the site conditions. So in this case, this is the Eden House project. I showed an earlier picture of it when it was in a failing bulkhead phase where it had failed for quite some time repeatedly. I guess it was Fish and Wildlife or Marine Fisheries decided to build a structure, which I'll get into agriculture still, and they planted, we provided this particular plant. It is the one plant that is capable of working in this situation. It is the only plant that can do this. It's fresh water, it grows up to a certain water level, and it's friggin' hard to produce. So hydrology is just referring to the water depth and the moisture levels. Salinity, we don't get so much salinity here, but we do have some. So as you get closer to the Outer Banks, you have to really work into salinity into your plant selection if you're in a lowland area. Soil type, obviously we don't typically have sand dunes here, but in a lot of areas that's really important. And this is one of the few plants that can handle that kind of sandy soil where it's actually intermittently wet. And then sun and shade. So this is an area where they're controlling erosion and it's being recently planted with trees, so it's going to be very shady, so they chose a shade tolerant plant. We always want the plants to be locally native. And the most important place for that, unless it's turf grass, and I'll go into one example where you can use turf grass. If you're near water, or if you have a chance of draining into water, you always have to presume that a non-native plant is going to be invasive. And it can take a while to find this out, but are any of you from New Jersey or New York? Up here, okay. Oh, you got some, okay, great. Well, you know the Hackensack Meadowlands?
I know Hackensack.
Okay,
I
but
was
you know
on
the
the side
Meadowlands.
of the Delaware, but I knew
Yeah.
Hackensack.
Well, you got a lot of this plant here.
Yeah.
So this is, I mean, to talk about how native, locally native it has to be to not be invasive in a wetland condition. This is actually the same species as grows native here, but it's genetically originated in Europe. And that plant is highly invasive. We haven't got affected by it very much here yet. Even upland areas, back in, I guess it was started maybe in the 40s to the 60s, they really tried hard to control erosion, and what they were looking for, this was the USDA, they wanted plants that would grow really quickly and cover a lot of ground, because you would think that you would want that. So they chose some Asian plants, and this particular one is kudzu, and we all know what happened about that. Also, it's not very good at controlling erosion because it's a vine, and vines don't have deep roots.
My mother-in-law went into a nursing home in South Georgia, and we went over one time, and the kudzu was going through the window and coming into the house. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, because it's the wrong plant in the wrong place. There's nothing here that controls kudzu naturally. I mean, you can get a herd of goats, but there's nothing that normally lives here. If it's a native plant to this area, there are already mechanisms in place that are going to keep it from being invasive. And when I talk about invasive, I don't mean that they're not going to be aggressive. Like, I think you mentioned somebody saying that cane, the Londonarea tecta, which grows you live in the Almora plantation or these areas where there's swales, you get this plant. And somebody was calling it invasive, but it's really not invasive. It's just a vigorous grower in these ideal conditions. But we don't want invasive. That's a bad thing, because it's going to knock out the good stuff. And we want, the other reason to have locally native plants is that we want to support our local pollinators. So this is a grass that, it's like many grasses. You don't think of grasses as being pollinator support plants, but they really are. They're support for the larvae. So the other thing is that the way that these plants have evolved locally is that they become the basis of the food web because they can harvest the sun, and there becomes a whole community that can be growing in the same, on the same basis, but not causing problems. So lots of insect life, and maybe some arachnoids, and birds and such that can use this substrate to grow. So let's go over a few case studies. So here's I just took this picture coming back from the vets, and these are two adjacent yards. This is one area where turf grass can be really helpful. So one yard, the roadside ditch, they had just kept it mowed with a weed whacker. It was steep enough for that. The other guy across the street had herbicided it. And you can see, I mean, it's eroded, and this is not an area where we have high water flows overland for the most part. But you do this long enough, this is what will happen. And at this point, it's eroded below the level of the culvert. So it's now holding saturated soil on the bottom. And so it's very hard to grow grass at this point. So what has to happen then to make this stable is the sides have to be recontoured, the base has to be brought up, and you have to put turf in. You have to put sod because you can't plant in that situation and expect it to make it. So you see a lot of people who have herbicided their ditches. This is my driveway. My driveway was gravel, and it used to end up in the neighbor's yard because my house is built on stream bed, and the driveway is built on stream bed right around the corner. And all the gravel from the driveway would just move into my neighbor's yard every time we had a heavy storm. So, and it eroded down, the driveway was no longer there. So in that case, I had to, because I have to park, put a cement pad top it with brick mortar in place. But then, it's hard to see here, but there's the wax myrtles which were put in first. This was after the wax myrtles, and all the pine straw that was there ended up behind the wax myrtles. Then a row of a plant that's mostly for pollinator support. And then here, which you really can't see growing in yet, but this will grow into be about a 18-inch or so solid mass of green, really fine stems. It's a plant called Juncus tenuis. And it's mulched with pine straw now, but it will become continuous. And that plant I chose because it is capable of growing in highly compacted, eroded soils with really it could be flooded, it could be dry, and it's going to be fine. You can even walk on it, but it's a little tall. So we'll see how that works, but I have a very good feeling about it. It's a little experiment. Here's another, this is a common scenario. People live in certain areas on the shorelines, and they have erosion here. And in this case, they recontoured it to make a little slope to have the gravity also help with the wave energy. In my opinion, they should have brought the plants down closer to the water because there are species who can do that. They're not the same species that can work up here, but there are other species like this one that can be closer to the water. Oh, and here's the 5 meters of marsh decrease wave energy by 50%, 20 meters by 90%. So it shows you that the bigger you have of this softening area, the bigger an impact you're going to have. New Jersey, lower Delaware Bay, which, I mean, you can see there's a pipe coming out here. They've been trying to stabilize this with stuff, hard things. what they did, and you can imagine what this soil was like, but they put in, these are called coir logs, so they're coconut fiber logs. They put that in to kind of break up the wave, the little bit of wave energy that comes from the boats going by. And then they planted in between with this plant. And this is 1 year later. So this is for trying to alternate flora. So it's really good. It's very high nutrient soil because it's got a lot of petroleum products that are in it. And then they'll probably go through and remove this, because you want this marsh and other vegetation now to be able to extend up to the parking area. This is an offshore sill. I forget where this one is. I think it's somewhere in North Carolina. But basically they have this very nice toe of a little projection of the marsh, very healthy salt marsh. And they put this here. This is not riprap in the traditional sense. This is out in the water, and it extends about a foot above high water, or normal water, and it's sized so that the water can actually go through it and decrease the wave energy. So this is a very, you can see it's a big open area, and they're trying to protect this toe, and that way the water can come through. There's a quiet area right behind it, which tends to support a lot of submerged aquatic vegetation, and a lot of really good things the fish can hide out in there. So it kind of looks like it's a hardened structure, but it's actually not. It's a way to protect the existing marsh. So here is the Eden House project. This is down near Paul Wharf's, near Wharf Landing. So it's where the fishing pier is, and this was taken in 2004, I think, before they started the project, and it just year after year, you probably know, John, how many times it's had to be replaced. I mean, it's a big fetch. It goes across, all the way across the Chon River. It's got the river flow. It's got a big exposure to hurricanes, and it would just fail. So what happened is they went in and they put one of these offshore sills. So this is actually down to about 2 feet of water. It extends about a foot above normal water. There's openings in it to allow fish passage. So there's like a second of this. This is a really high energy area. You cannot stabilize this with a normal, you can't plant it. That's not going to work. So the Coastal Federation did this one. And then we planted it with that really hard to grow plant. That is the one thing that can possibly stabilize this. And this is shortly after installation. I mean, certainly within a year. It got hit by a hurricane like that same summer, and everything stayed in place. They did slope a little bit behind it, and they actually realized that they actually didn't have to even slope that much. They could have just left it water. And this is what it looked like a couple of years ago. I took a picture. They did plant behind it with shrubs, which I kind of understand why they did that. They didn't want people to cut through it, to try to cut through it to get to the water. But it blocks the view of the water from anybody who's in the parking lot, which is kind of, you don't always want in a lot of areas. Like these plants, even though they're probably up to here on me if I stood on their base, when you're up on top here, you're looking straight over the top. You're not seeing that height because it's well below your body, your eye level. But I think they really wanted that for other reasons on the site. So here's our waterfront here, Edenton Bay. The town put these in, this riprap in not too long ago, right, to try to stabilize this toe. This is an area that has a very big exposure, and when the winds come from the south, it really gets hammered. It's got a hardened structure, a hardened vertical structure, which appears to have been eroding downward. It's got extra hard structure here, so this corner now has like a giant window pile of riprap. And they put the riprap in to try to break up the wave energy, because it is, at least it's not a vertical hard surface, it's an irregular surface, so it will break down the wave energy some. But the waves are still coming over and eroding behind it. So can anybody, based on, this is pure, like, I'm just throwing stuff out here, right? Can anybody think, based on what I talked about, what maybe a couple approaches to this would be if you wanted to try to prevent this scour?
Put one of those sills out there with those oyster shells so the water can come through.
That would probably, that's probably the way that you could stabilize this with vegetation. You would have to do that. You could not, you can plant this area and you can maybe prevent these little scours if you put, say, that pink muley grass that I showed before. I don't know if I have it. Something that grows, you know, so tall and it's really pretty. The issue is that people use this for walking, so it would be well below their line of sight, and I think it's the right thing to do. But ideally, you'd want to cover a good chunk of this, and that might interfere with pedestrian access. But that would probably, even that alone, would probably really decrease this degree of erosion. The way to stabilize it for the good would be to put an offshore sill in. But the trouble, because that would work, and you would use that Zizaniopsis, that plant that it just makes that solid mass of green. Because nobody enters and exits the water here too, which is an advantage. It would become a true living shoreline. There would be a lot of biological activity in there. It's just amazing. You put those plants in there, and there's all sorts of minnows and little shrimp, and it just comes alive. It's just amazing to watch that process, like within weeks. It's incredible. So it would support the fisheries, because the baby fish would have a place to get established. But it would go against our traditional aesthetic of turf grass up to a hardened structure. And that's the primary obstacle or speed bump towards these kinds of approaches. They are challenging to overcome that standard aesthetic. But the only other way you can really handle this is you raise it up, but you have to have drainage off this street. So it's, a living shoreline is probably the correct way to do it, but whether it could be acceptable to most people it would be a challenge, it would be an educational issue to get people comfortable with that. Tips for success: you want to install your plants really close together, so you use a bunch of little plants really close together rather than a few big apart plants, because you don't want the water to flow in between the plants, you want it to refract off. You want to install your plants at the season of maximum growth, which is usually spring. Sometimes you need protection, and the living shorelines are a permanent protection. And for instance, where that even like in our front yard here, basically Eden Bay, never seen that Eden Bay, Edenton Bay, yeah. Of course, I should know that. You know, you won't have boats trying to come up through it. But sometimes you need plants to have a temporary protection. So those coir logs that were in the New Jersey picture, those will eventually go away. But the plants will be established. And this is all coir in a different situation in Australia. And the plants will be planted through here, but it'll go away. But by that time, the plants are capable of stabilizing the site. So, any questions? Yes, Grace. You have a situation.
Yeah, well, and bulkheads are expensive, but when you said aesthetics, is that why you think everybody that lives around me has turf grass and has to fill the holes all the time? Because I'm wondering if, I guess that if you have one of those shorelines or marsh grass, most people would want to walk in their yard a little bit. Could they do that right by the water and then have something that they can walk in, or can you walk in that marsh stuff?
You cannot walk in that to anything else that you would, that I would say would be preferable for your site. So Graceland's on the north side of the Alamo Sound on one of those high banks. And so the bulkhead is doing what bulkheads do. It's eroding around the side, which does go down to a nice grade, and it's eroding over the top. So you could put a 4-foot width of that purple muley grass, the really pretty pink thing that I showed earlier on with all the stems. You could do that on the top, and it would probably really help. But
I wouldn't have to fill the holes up.
it should prevent the filling of holes, yes.
Okay, I
Yes.
have one more question, and that is, if I put that grass there, would I have more bugs than I do now?
You would have the kind of butterflies and stuff that use that plant to survive. So it would not make like mosquitoes or anything like that worse. If anything, there's some evidence that with all these plants, these native plants, if you have these the sort of buffer areas, the areas where there's native vegetation, they actually support the predators that eat the bugs we don't like. It keeps things in balance. But I gotta say that where you live in that situation, you have to have a hardened structure.
Right, because the house will fall in the water.
Right, you do, because it's one of those bluffs. And probably not, I mean, if there was a living shoreline, it could be built there, but it would have to cover that whole development probably. So it would be a big job that would require some serious funding, which if you got a grant could be possible, but it's not something that an average homeowner could do. Because it's a super high energy site and it's not contained. It's right out there. Even the house, the wildlife place is contained.
You had said that shore, those bluffs are eroding quickly, and we're in a part of the world where that's just natural, and like Drummond Point, in one woman's lifetime, a mile and a half into the sea. Grace is a few miles up the shore from there.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the shore bluff going to disappear in the next 50 years?
If it wasn't stabilized, yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's a case where you artificially stabilize it. Because it will, yeah, those bluffs were not, they would, if you find them other places where they even haven't been developed, they disappear, they do.
I think I know the answer to this, but what are the chances of being able to put bald cypress out into the river a little bit further, like in front of, for aesthetics, for habitat?
Right.
Because I definitely noticed, because I've lost 2 trees from the hurricane, and I've noticed the fish are, because it's sunny, and they've got no shaded area to be
Right,
protected.
and they like to have
Yeah,
things in the
exactly.
water.
And I'd like to make some better habitat.
Right.
What would you suggest there?
Well,
If not, bald cypress, which is what I like. but-
right, no, bald cypress would be the choice, okay? So if you're gonna do that, it's gonna be bald cypress because that's the plant that'll grow there, okay? You're achieving you're on the Chon River, big exposure. There's another Nyssa aquatica that will grow in, but it's more protected. So bald cypress is the way to go. There was a professor at the Baruch Institute in Georgetown, South Carolina. My name got on this paper, but I don't even know if I ever read it. But he said that he was having success by getting bald cypress bare root seedlings that were several feet tall and pruning them down to a single carat, basically, and putting them in offshore, and he was having success. So the bald cypress it can grow in standing water, but its top definitely has to be out. So you want like 2/3 if you can, or at least half to be out. So you want to it can be hard when you have an eroding area to get water depth. But you have some spots, because you're going to be having erosion too, reflecting off the bulkhead, which they need in order to save the property. Because again, unless that would be a site for a living shoreline, you actually have a good site for a living shoreline.
Which I knew you before we put in the bulkhead.
Well, yeah, but that's, you can still go for funding. So, but it would be one of the more challenging living shorelines, but it probably would be actually quite effective there.
Do you ever come out and assess property and help property owners decide what would work and?
No. There are companies that do that, for sure, and the North Carolina Coastal Federation has done the bulk of the early work on this, and they have a lot of resources, and they actually managed to, until a few years ago, you could easily get a permit for a bulkhead. You could not get a permit for a living shoreline because they said they were too complex. But they've changed that, so it's under a general permit, so it's much easier to get a permit to put something in there. Because when you go, especially because when you go and do an offshore sill, you're moving into the waterway. You are their concern was you're going to be building land, but actually if it's designed right, it just keeps erosion away. So, but no, no.
Do you have a list of plants that you recommend?
It depends, it's entirely site specific, so it depends, you gotta know the water level, so the people who do, and in the freshwater, it's just this one species, so actually, and I wish I could just say like, here's who to call, but I think the Coastal Federation would get you that information. And they used to come out and look at sites, and they have provided funding, like for Meredith, theirs was paid for by the Coastal Federation, or at least a major cost share. It was an experimental site.
Projects like this, whether it's on a homeowner's property, whether it's the Bayfront here at Edenton, is all of this under the purview of the state? They need to sign off on whatever you're doing?
Yeah, so the coastal energy management people, they need to sign off on it. But now that it's under a general permit, if you're planting waterward, okay, if you're just putting plants in the water, they don't have to sign off on anything. You can put all the plants in the water that you want. If you're putting a structure there or putting fill there, you have to have a permit. But at this point, it's a general permit, which is easy to get, fast and easy. But you don't want to be doing that kind of work without somebody knowing what should be done, because it's just a waste of. They're not the world's cheapest projects, because you got to get out there, like those living shorelines, you got to get out there, it's not the easiest thing. One of the things that they're doing them with, though, which helps, is instead of using riprap, it would not be appropriate for where we are, because you want to do it in the oyster habitat potential area, which we're not there yet. But they use bags of oyster shells, and they use them instead of the riprap, and then the oysters come and colonize it. We don't currently have the facility to support that, but that's used now in the Outer Banks, I think pretty dominantly. There's a lot of these going in the Outer Banks. Not on the ocean side, on the sound side. So the other way, am I running too late?
No.
Okay. Almost done. Was that?
I didn't even look at my watch.
She said no.
So the other way that everybody can do if they garden at all, the other way that nature prevents erosion is by decreasing the amount of runoff from any given area. So the amount of rain that flows off the site. And if you have, say, undisturbed native plants in healthy soil, the rain that falls, 25% feeds the shallow groundwater, which is really important because that's what maintains the little streams and the little waterways, which are really important. 25% feeds the deep groundwater, which is really important. And then 10%, only 10% runs off from the surface. The rest goes to evapotranspiration. So if you replace, say, the vegetation by a residential neighborhood, so this is not here, this is in the Piedmont, but this is not, you wouldn't even think, like, this looks like a pretty good area, but until you see the stream. The upstream area here was converted to a residential area. So now all the runoff from that residential area is going into pipes and feeding what used to be a little sweet stream. And in a pretty short period of time, it erodes the whole stream down till it hits like basically rock. And there's no base flow. There's no little water in the bottom, so little fish can't live there anymore. It should normally have a nice little layer of water, but it's gone because there's nothing feeding the base flow. So even though this spot here looks like a nice forest, the people upstream are preventing that natural process through their development, which, I mean, you gotta have people, so you want to try to see if you can stop that process. And in this case, when they replaced that vegetation with a residential neighborhood, only 10% went to the shallow groundwater, which was not enough to maintain the base flow. 5% goes to the deep groundwater, so you know what's going to happen in the low run, and 55% runs off, and that's a big difference. So some ways that you can mimic, if you're a gardener at all, that you can mimic nature by reducing runoff is to have areas in your yard or garden that capture the rain. And any amount that you can capture and let it sink in is that much less that runs off. So these are some fancy schmancy ones. I think this one is in Raleigh, the Museum of Art or something. So they have a multi-tiered system to capture the rainwater before it hits the receiving stream. This is just somebody's garden in their yard, so they slope the garden down to what is a rain garden, so it collects the water and then soaks in. Again, this is the soil that can pass water through, but instead of getting it down to the street side ditch or the street, you run it through this first. And that takes out all the nutrients, it cleans it up, it supports the pollinators, it provides habitat, and it keeps the runoff down. This is a fancy one. Again, in an urban area where they've had a lot of hardscape, but the water's being directed into this area. And this would be, in this case, because it's in a highly developed area, it's got under drains so that it all gets cleaned out before it goes to the receiving pipe. And here's one in more of a less well-developed area. So they're directing the water into this little low area that can hold maybe a foot or two of water, and then gradually let it soak in. So those are the kind of things you can do even in the miniature scale in your front yard.
And you would do that where you see a lot of puddles, you know, when after every
Yes,
rain,
if you see an
you see
area.
the big lake, and so that's where you would probably.
That's where you would, exactly, that's where you would do it, and you would like dig it up. You would want to have nice compost in there, because compost really helps with this process. And then you plant it with plants that can tolerate being saggy sometimes, and then drying out, which is like the mass of the native flowers, etc. And grasses. They're like really well adapted to that, because that's what happens here. It gets wet and then it gets dry. So, any other questions? This is the adult version of the little babies. It does grow up to be beautiful. And I put this little one in, because most of our work actually is not in erosion control, it's in stormwater management. So that's where most of our plants grow. We grow 1.3 million plants a year. They go to these kind of projects that are used for stormwater management primarily. But in Wilmington, there was a park that was planted. It was 11 acres, and within a year they had nesting So that was really good, and just to show you how when you put plants in these areas, wildlife comes. And in New Bern, they have and flooding decreases. They have a very big project that we worked on. But it was for downtown urban, like really downtown urban New Bern. But a residential area, but like not the prettiest place. And they put a big stormwater wetland in, and within something like 6 months, a birder who lived there counted 87 species of birds from an area that was basically an industrial wasteland. So it's pretty amazing. Yeah. So you planted, they will come. Okay, that's it.
If you had to grade the waterways around here, how healthy are they? That's another topic, not native plants, but I'm just talking about.
Right. Well, so, I mean, when I first moved here, which was in '96, they looked good, right? But as I began to understand them more, they're highly impacted. So, like, say the herring fishery, well, we ditched and drained everything so that the way that where the herring used to spawn, those areas are not the same anymore. So they're actually highly impacted, and I think we see when we get algae blooms and such, we're seeing that. I know that, and then we're having sea level rise, which is happening. So we're getting impacted by that. So there's actually quite a bit of impact. Still a lot better than New Jersey. So, yeah, I mean, you want to see what can happen? But, you know, they're doing a lot of work too, like on that Delaware Bay site, and it's a site that you would not put your toe in that water. And they're cleaning it up and bringing it back, so.
Is it too simple, because a lot of places flood, is it too simple to say that a lot of flooding could be prevented if people planted the right things? Are we just that dumb? If we don't plant the right stuff?
It's not just, so when you get into like urban development and suburban development even, I mean, it takes actually quite a bit of engineering to set up the conditions that will allow the plants to thrive and contain that much flow. So, and there's a lot, I mean, in areas that are more urbanized, like a lot of our work is up in Raleigh-Durham area, right? So they're all built to really minimize their runoff, because they will get major flooding if they don't. I mean, they learn their lesson, and you gotta follow those rules. And it used to be, they used to get away with it, when like Wilmington was really bad, but now they don't get away with it because it's, you gotta put these things in. But they're highly engineered structures. They're not just planting a little area.
Is there any program to educate or do you see any support from the Lowe's, the Home Depots, the Walmarts that sell plants are any of these people or any of these companies willing to be educated to sell native plants from their area? Because the small nurseries or the native nurseries, they're more than willing to help you educate, but we're not always going to be able to know where to go for that. We're going to run to Lowe's or Home Depot or Walmart. We see that pretty mom, but we could also get a swamp sunflower or an ironweed or something like that. So, but you don't find those in those places. So how can we educate the general population, including myself, to work with the retail stores to do something different natively or locally in their community, so to speak?
Right, that's a really good question. I mean, I know that they made a lot of progress for pollinators. Like they'll say this is a pollinator plant, which I think is really, really good. There's a whole industry. So erosion control is kind of outside of what they would get into. But native plants, just using natives, I think think they have made some progress. I know they're trying to change some of the regulations so that if the municipality, they have to do native plants. There's a lot of, like, just, say, we're the biggest provider of native wetland plants, right? So we're trying to get Cheryl here, educated, to be the retail division, because we can't do retail. We can't. We're dealing with big projects. And so, I mean, even for us, we want, it's not her fault. She's very good. It's me, like, I can get a bunch of stuff together. But there's a lot that goes into it. And there's a lot of education, and there's a lot of educating people that they don't need a cult of, like, that they're not, we go a wild type, right? Because they have to handle these natural situations. Well, they're not little dinky plants. They're not. Like, they're really beautiful, but you plant them, but they're not little dinky things. So, that's a whole aesthetic thing that you have to get used to. But I gotta say, there's been a lot of progress in the 20 years I've been doing this. There really is. I mean, people want natives now. I mean, we're in the tree committee, right? And we just talked about that, like having natives be on the tree list. Like, just you do natives, that's just it. Because there's no drawback to it.
I want to thank, go ahead.
One last question. The slides you were showing, some of these restoration projects, erosion control projects, with the grasses and all, look more like, marsh and all coming up from the shore. I thought the marshes were very attractive versus the eroded banks and the broken bulkheads. Isn't that fairly compelling in terms of getting people to think about a new aesthetic and what the shoreline should look like?
Yeah, but it's a change. I mean, yes, for me it is. It's highly compelling. But for many people, it's not the picture-perfect British model of turf grass down to the water's edge. So it's a change in mindset. And in certain areas, like in the Great Lakes area, they've done huge. The garden club ladies have completely changed the approach to lakefront landscaping. I mean, they just, like, these well-to-do, very high society ladies just sort of made it their mission, and to be in the in crowd, you had to do it right. And that meant not having their stuff down in the water. So, and it worked.
Good plan.
Yeah. So, okay. Now
I just want to thank you so much. It was very, very informative, and I understand now why I've got erosion on either side of my bulkhead. Yeah. So anyway, and I want to thank you. That was very, very interesting. And I encourage you all to come see Katie,